Well, you could say quantity would become quality, and there would be a sort of a spontaneous transformation of society. But political activism was not required.
It's about making a new you, that if enough people changed the way they were, that the society would change.
So the personal became political?
Yes, the personal became political. Without changing the personal, you didn't stand a chance of changing the political. Coming up against the state power of the United States was not an option. I mean, they outgunned us.
It's a basic fear of that thing inside me, like a little demon in there. It doesn't come out very often. It's really hard to get it out.
Now put the thing inside you on that chair and talk to it.
Pearls used to call this getting on the hot seat.
Reserved, and they tended to be more reserved than other normal people were told, don't be so reserved, let it all out. You're a good person. You can afford to be who you really are. You don't need to play the role of a man. You don't need to sit down for yourself. Prudence is an oversold virtue.
You're trying to assert yourself, trying to find out who you are, who you're becoming. At the same time, you're trying to live a life of dedication and service, and you're trying to make all these things fit into who you are, and you're just, it's such a turmoil at times that you blow a gasket and do silly, crazy things. Running around the orchard and stealing things and taking cokes out of the refrigerator. Crazy. So I felt like I was being a hypocrite.
Nuns voted to discard their habits in favor of ordinary clothes. But the psychotherapists found they had awoken other forces.
One of the things we unleashed was sexual energy. The kind of thing that the church had been very good at restraining was no longer to be restrained. One sister who was a member of the community, she got the idea that she could be freer than she had been before, and she seduced one of her classmates and then seduced the mistress of novices, who was an older woman, very reserved, and her program of freeing this older woman was sexual. She drove her to the store, and when they drove back and drove into the garage, she leaned over and gave her a big kiss on the lips. And thereafter, sister, who had perhaps never been kissed before, was ready for more.
The effect of the experiment on the convent was cataclysmic. Within a year, 300 nuns, more than half the convent, petitioned the Vatican to be released from their vows. And 6 months later, the convent closed its doors. All that was left was a small group of nuns, but they had become radical lesbian nuns. The rest gave up the religious life.
That's for love, for experience, positive way of life. We don't say that you're wrong. We just want to be free to be what we want to be, or what we find ourselves to be, as we continue to search ourselves.
And it was beginning to have a serious effect on corporate America, because these new selves were not behaving as predictable consumers. The life insurance industry in particular was concerned that fewer and fewer college students were buying life insurance when they left university. They asked Daniel Yankelovich, America's leading market researcher, to investigate. He had studied psychoanalysis.
The life insurance business, more than any other business at the time, was built on the Protestant ethic. You only bought life insurance if you were a person who sacrificed for the future. If you lived in the present, you had no need for life insurance. So they had some sense that maybe the sort of core values of the Protestant ethic were being challenged by some of these new values that were beginning to appear. And I was really astonished at what I found. The conventional interpretation, the dominant interpretation, was that it had to do with political radicalism. But, it was clear to us that that was a mask, a cover. The core of it had to do with self-expressiveness. That this preoccupation with the self and the inner self, that was what was so important to people. The ability to be self-expressive.
Wow, what a feeling! 300 miles to go. What out of sight.
The idea that this product expresses me, and whether it was a small European car, the particular music system, your presentation of self, your clothing.
For immediate energy from our muscles and
These become ways in which people can expend their money in order to say to the world who they are. But the manufacturers, they had no idea of what was going on really with consumers and in the market at large.
Major advertising companies set up what they called operating groups to try and work out how to appeal to these new individuals. The head of one agency sent a memo to all staff. We must conform, he told them, to the new non-conformists. We must listen to the music of Bobby Dylan and go to the theatre more. But the problem was, few of the self-expressive individuals would take part in focus groups. The advertisers were left to their own devices.
There's a new cereal that tastes so right. Makes you dance, it's a way out of sight. It's tasty little squares of malted wheat. It's crispy and it's crunchy and it tastes so neat. Faster though.
That's what I'm saying. Use a folk rock with more rock than folk.
And there was an even more serious problem. To make products for people who wanted to express themselves would mean creating variety. But the systems of mass production that had been developed in America were only profitable if they made large numbers of the same objects. This had fitted perfectly with the limited range of desires of a conformist society. The expressive self threatened this whole system of manufacture. And the threat was about to grow rapidly.
Go!
Because an entrepreneur had invented a way of mass-producing this new independent self. Many of Earhart's techniques came from the human potential movement. He criticized the movement for not having gone far enough. Their idea that there was a central core inside all human beings was, he said, just another limitation on human freedom. In reality, there was no fixed self, which meant that you could be anything that you wanted to be.
The thesis of the human potential movement was that there was something really good down in there. And if you took these layers off, what you were going to wind up with was a kernel, a something that was innately self-expressive, that was the true self, that was going to be a wonderful thing. In actuality, we found people who'd gone to the last layer and took off the last layer and found that what was left was nothing.
All right, guys! Go! Do it!
The S sessions were intense and often brutal. The participants signed contracts agreeing not to leave and to allow the trainers to do anything they thought necessary to break down their socially constructed identities.
Come on, sandwiched in there. Go for a win!
If I push harder than you do, I'm gonna squash you. So you better push fast. Now, hard, do it! That's it, do it, again! Push, good, good, good! Again! Yes!
The real point of the S training was to go down through layer after layer after layer after layer until you got to the last layer and peeled it off, where the recognition was that it's really all meaningless and empty. Now, that's existentialism's endpoint. S went a step further in that people began to recognize that it was not only meaningless and empty, but it was empty and meaningless that it was empty and meaningless. And in that, there's an enormous freedom. All the constrictions, all of the rules you placed on yourself are gone. And what you're left with is nothing. And nothing is an extraordinarily powerful place to stand, because it is only from nothing that you can create. And from this nothing, people were able to invent a life and allowing them to create themselves. Invent themselves. You can be what you want to be.
I want you to start to make that sound, and on that sound, create and people the world the way you want to create it.
What Earhart did was to say that only the individual matters, that there is no societal concern, that you living a fulfilled life is all you need be concerned about. Est people came out of those trainings feeling that it wasn't selfish to think about yourself, it was your highest duty.
So kiss me and smile for me, tell me that you'll wait for me, hold me like you never let me go.
The training is 2 weekends. And it was quite an incredible experience in my life. I'll forever be grateful for the experience. I got a great deal out of it. We really want to know who we are. There are things going on. We learn more and more about ourselves all the time. And to really find out what it is that makes us tick and how we are discovering ourselves.
Est became hugely successful. Singers, film stars, and hundreds of thousands of ordinary Americans underwent the training in the 1970s. But in the process, the political idea that had begun the movement for personal transformation began to disappear. The original vision had been that through discovering and expressing the self, a new culture would be born, one that would challenge the power of the state.
We will not let them separate our culture from our politics. We are a people. We are all together.
But what was now emerging was the idea that people could be happy simply within themselves, and that changing society was irrelevant. One of the proponents of this was Jerry Rubin. In 1968, Rubin, as leader of the Yippies, had led the march on Chicago, but now he had undergone S training.
I was willing to die, and I had a martyr complex in a sense. I think we all did. And I've given up that ideal of sacrifice. And I'm not as overwhelmingly moved by injustice as I was. And now we reincarnated ourselves from within.
Basically, the politics were lost and totally replaced by this lifestyle. And then the desire to become deeper and deeper into the self. By now, a grandiose sense of the self. And my good friend and one of the original Yippie founders, Jerry Rubin, definitely moved in that direction. And I think he was beginning to buy into the notion that he could be happy and fully self-developed on his own. Socialism in one person.
Yes. Was he alone in that?
Although that, of course, is capitalism.
That's the whole joke. I think it's funny. I think it's funny because people spend so much of their life being bedeviled by their past and being locked into their past and being limited by their past. And there's an enormous freedom from that, letting people create themselves.
Est was only the most vivid and intense expression of an idea that was spreading rapidly through all strata of American society. Books and television programs promoted the idea that one's first duty was to be oneself. And those monitoring this shift were astonished at the speed with which the idea was spreading.
In 1970, it was a small percentage of the total population, maybe 3 to 5%. By 1980, it had spread to the vast majority of the public, up to 80%.
You asked the question, how do you get self-actualized? You take this day and you say, when I shave every morning, I look in that mirror, I say to myself, I really say this, I say, nobody is going to ruin this day for you, Wayne Dyer, nobody.
That this preoccupation with the self and the inner self traveled and spread throughout the society in the 1970s.
It helped me to stop living in the past and start building from today and using my experiences in a positive way to be a better person today and tomorrow.
But then the problem comes, well, how do you be self-expressive?
And it was at this point that American capitalism decided it was going to step in and help these new individuals to express themselves, and in the process, make a lot of money. The first thing they were going to do was to find a way of getting inside their heads, to discover what these new beings wanted in order to be themselves. This came not from Madison Avenue, but from one of the most powerful scientific research institutes in America. Stanford Research Institute in California worked for corporations and government. It had done much of the early work on computers and was also working for the Department of Defense on what would become the Star Wars project. In 1978, a group of economists and psychologists at SRI decided to find a way to read, measure, and fulfill the desires of these new, unpredictable consumers.
The idea was to create a rigorous tool for measuring a whole range of desires, wishes, values that prior to that time had been kind of overlooked. They say in business, what gets measured gets done. We were basically telling manufacturers, if you're really going to satisfy not just the basic needs, but individuated wants, whims, and desires of more highly developed human beings, you're going to have to segment. You're going to have to individuate.
To do this, SRI turned for help to those who had begun the liberation of the self. In particular, one of the leaders of the human potential movement, a psychologist called Abraham Maslow. Through observing the work at places like Esalen, Maslow had invented a new system of psychological types. He called it the hierarchy of needs, and it described the different emotional stages that people went through as they liberated their feelings. At the top was self-actualization. This was the point at which individuals became completely self-directed and free of society. The team at SRI thought that Maslow's hierarchy might form the basis for a new way to categorize society, not by social class, but by different psychological desires and drives. To test this, they designed a huge questionnaire with hundreds of questions about how people saw themselves, their inner values. The questions were designed to see whether people fitted into Maslow's categories.
We were trying to find out what people really felt like. So we asked these really penetrating questions, and we hired a company that administers surveys, to do them. They said they've never seen anything like it. Usually you have to send out a postcard 6 weeks and then another postcard, and then you got to call the people up, to get the return rates up. We had an 86% return, and they only sent out one postcard. People loved filling out this questionnaire. We got several questionnaires back with a note attached saying, do you have any other questionnaires I could fill out? Because we were asking people to think about things that they had never thought about before, and they liked thinking about them. Yeah, like what they felt inside, what motivated them, what was their life about, what was important to them. It was sort of like, wow.
The answers were then analyzed by computer. It revealed that there were underlying patterns in the way people felt about themselves, which fitted Maslow's categories. And at the top of the hierarchy were a large and growing group which cut across all social classes. The SRI team called them the inner directives. These were people who felt they were not defined by their place in society, but by the choices they made themselves. But what SRI discovered was that these people could be defined by the different patterns of behavior through which they chose to express themselves. Self-expression was not infinite. It fell into identifiable types. And the SRI team invented a new term for it: lifestyles. They had managed to categorize the new individualism. They called their system Values and Lifestyles, VALS for short.
At the forefront of this change are 3 new VALS groups we call inner-directed. These are people for whom personal satisfaction is more important than status or money. They tend to be self-expressive, complex, and individualistic. Rob is an I am me. I am me's are searching for new values, breaking away from traditions and inventing their own standards. Rob even invented his own name, Rob Noxious. Jody is an experiential. This is a group seeking inner growth through direct experience. Experientials aren't in one place much. This is the try-anything-once crowd, and all that activity takes goods and services. Their hobbies are hands-on, and their possessions are simple, but not always simply priced.
I'm a bookseller. I sell books. I'm a businessman. That doesn't necessarily mean that I believe in capitalism. It just happens to be what I'm doing now.
SRI created a simplified questionnaire with just 30 key questions. Anyone who answered them could be immediately fitted into a dozen or so of these new groups. It allowed businesses to identify which groups were buying their products, and from that, how the goods could be marketed so they became powerful emblems of those groups' inner values and lifestyles. It was the beginning of lifestyle marketing.
So it allowed people not just to look at people as demographics, group of age and income and whatever, but to really understand the underlying motivations. I mean, most of marketing was looking at people's actions and trying to figure out what to do. But what we were doing is we were trying to look more into people's underlying values so that we could predict what is their lifestyle, what kind of house do they live in, what kind of car do they drive. So the corporations were then able to sell things to them by understanding them, by having labels, by knowing what these people look like, where they live, what their lifestyles are.
If a new product expressed a particular group's values, it would be bought by them. This is what made the values and lifestyle system so powerful, its ability to predict what new products self-actualizers would choose. And this power was about to be demonstrated dramatically. VALS would show it could predict not just the products they would buy, but the politicians they were going to choose to elect.
Ladies and gentlemen, the next president of the United States of America, Ronald Reagan!
In 1980, Ronald Reagan ran for president. He and his advisors were convinced they could win on a program of a new individualism. It would be an attack on 50 years of government interference in people's lives.
I wrote a speech about let the people make the basic decisions, get judges out of the way, get bureaucrats out of the way, get centralized government out of the way. I gave Reagan a choice of several titles for the speech, and the one he picked was let the people rule. Let the people regain rule, regain control over their own destiny away from a remote elite in Washington.
I would like to think that the kind of leadership that I would exercise in Washington is not the kind of leadership that I would pretend that I can solve all the problems I've been discussing here, but that together, you and I can. I would like to take the lead in taking government off the backs of the American people and turning you loose to do what I know you can do.
It was radical. Moderate Republicans thought it was suicide. Jimmy Carter called it ridiculous. The press was extremely negative. But the odd thing is that it polled very well in New Hampshire, which was the first primary state, the state that we had to win.
What was odd was that there seemed to be a strange mosaic of support for Reagan's policies. The traditional pollsters could see no coherent pattern across class, age, or gender. But those who had designed the values and lifestyle system believed that they knew why. They were testing their system in both America and Britain. And they were convinced that both Reagan's and Mrs. Thatcher's message about individual freedom would appeal to the group at the top of their hierarchy, the inner directeds, because it fitted with the way they saw themselves.
They were really concerned about being individuals, being individualistic. And so in the early stages, when we were looking at the messages that both Thatcher and then Reagan were putting across, we said They are using words that will really appeal to a lot of the younger people, and particularly to the people who are moving towards self-actualization. We call them the inner-directed people. A lot of our colleagues said, that's absolutely ridiculous, because inner-directeds are very socially aware, very socially concerned. They'll never vote Conservative, or they'll never vote for the Republicans. But we said, if Thatcher and Reagan continue to appeal to them in this way, they really will.
And I vision leadership in taking government off your backs and turning you loose to do what you can do so well. Thank you very much.
The idea that the new self-actualizing individuals would choose a politician from the right, not the left, seemed extraordinary. But to test their prediction, the Values and Lifestyles team did a survey of voting intentions, and they correlated it with their new psychological categories.
When we said in our surveys, who are you going to vote for? Sure enough, it was the inner-directeds who said that they would vote for Thatcher and for Reagan. And they made the difference in those elections because of their voting for Thatcher and Reagan. And it really surprised our colleagues, even within my own organization. It really showed the power of this approach, because it's very difficult to identify inner-directeds on the street. These people who voted for Thatcher and Reagan, these inner-directeds, came from any walk of life. It's really hardly correlated with social class at all. I mean, if you just go along and look at age, sex, social class, you would never pick them up. But if you really go along with a questionnaire that gets at their values, then you can identify them very easily.
And that was new?
And that was completely new, yeah.
At the beginning of 1981, Ronald Reagan was inaugurated as president. But he took charge of a country that was facing economic disaster. The terrible inflation of the 1970s had destroyed much of America's traditional heavy industries, and millions were unemployed. But true to his campaign promises, Reagan told the country he would not step in to help, as all previous governments had since the war.
These United States are confronted with an economic affliction of great proportions. We suffer from the longest and one of the worst sustained inflations in our national history. Idle industries have cast workers into unemployment, human misery, and personal indignity. In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
But America's ailing economy was about to be rescued, not by government, but by the new groups that the market researchers had identified, the self-actualizing individuals. They were about to become the motor for what would be called the new economy.
You can be what you want to be.
So regarding V8, what do you really want?
A tasty product that's good for me.
What do you want that for?
One technique is that we ask people the same question over and over and over again, and we say, what do you want? What do you really want? What do you want that for? And they start to talk about it, and they kind of get intimate with what's going on. What we're doing with that technique is unpeeling the onion. If you want to think of a person kind of having layers and layers and layers of protection and thoughts and behaviors and beliefs, we want to get to that center core.
In the wake of the invention of values and lifestyles, a vast industry of psychological market research grew up. And the old technique of the focus group, invented by the Freudian psychoanalysts in the 50s, was used in a new and powerful way. The original aim of the focus group had been to find ways to entice people to buy a limited range of mass-produced goods. But now focus groups were used in a different way to explore the inner feelings of lifestyle groups, and out of that invent whole new ranges of products, which would allow those groups to express what they felt was their individuality. And the generation who had once rebelled against the conformity imposed by consumerism now embraced it, because it helped them to be themselves.